I don't know how to start this, and I don't even know if I should tell it. But there are things that stay with you forever, and this is one of them. Many years have passed, but I remember it like it was yesterday, like a bad dream that repeats itself over and over and doesn't let you rest. What happened with my cousin is something that should have never happened, and to this day, every time I think about everything she did, I can't help but feel a mixture of anger, sadness, and guilt. If it weren't for that damn deep web page, if it weren't for those empty promises, maybe I'd still have her with me. My cousin and I grew up together. We were like siblings, inseparable, and I always knew she was one of those people who lived with a shadow over her shoulders. Since she was a kid, she was insecure about her body, always feeling inadequate, always comparing herself to other girls who seemed to have it all. She was beautiful, but she never saw herself that way. For her, it was all about fitting into a mold that seemed impossible. She'd spend hours in front of the mirror, criticizing herself, looking for flaws no one else could see. I watched her destroy herself little by little, trapped in a battle against herself that never seemed to end. Things got worse during adolescence. Cruel comments and mockery became a daily occurrence. No matter how hard she tried to change, it was never enough. She tried every diet, signed up for the gym, followed every routine she found online, but always ended up back in the same place. Her self-esteem was in tatters, and although she tried to hide it, we all knew she was suffering. I remember once she told me she would give anything to look different, that if she could completely change her body, she'd do it without hesitation. I never imagined those words would become reality in such a dark way. It all started one night, one of those nights when you have nothing to do and end up wasting time on the internet. My cousin and her friends ventured into the deep web. It wasn't the first time. They had done it before as a way to find weird things and scare themselves a little. For them, it was a game, something forbidden and exciting that didn't have real consequences. They browsed pages full of disturbing content, strange videos, conspiracy theories, things no one in their right mind should see. It was like playing with fire. That night, they found something different, an ad that promised to change their lives, or at least that's what they thought. It offered free cosmetic surgeries to transform you into the ideal girl. They said it like that, bluntly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something like, transform your body, be the perfect version of yourself, all for free. According to the ad, the procedure involved removing fat, shaping hips, and other body parts to achieve the ideal figure. The justification for it being free was that supposedly the extracted material was sold on the same web. At first, my cousin and her friends laughed. It seemed like a joke, something too good to be true. But while they laughed, my cousin kept thinking about it. To her, it wasn't a joke. It was the answer to all her problems, the chance to change everything she hated about herself. What for others was just another internet stupidity, for her was a dream come true. And she couldn't get that idea out of her head. I tried to talk to her. I told her it didn't make sense, that no one gives anything away, especially not something as serious as surgery. I warned her it was dangerous, that there were a lot of weird things on the deep web and she couldn't trust an anonymous ad. But she didn't listen to me. She was so obsessed with the idea of looking different, so tired of hating her own reflection, that she didn't care about the risks. For her, this was her last chance. Weeks went by and my cousin kept investigating, more and more involved in that web. She read forums, looked for reviews from other girls who had supposedly had surgery there, and they all said the same. It was the best decision of my life. I'm happy with the results. It didn't cost me anything and I changed my life. But of course those comments were also anonymous and who knows if they were even real. No matter how many doubts I tried to plant in her mind, she had already decided she was going to do it. The day they confirmed her appointment, she celebrated as if she had won a prize. She showed me the message with a smile I hadn't seen on her face in years, a mix of joy and nervousness that made a knot form in my stomach. I knew something bad was going to happen, but I couldn't stop her anymore. They had given her a date, a time, and a precise location on a road 90 kilometers from where we lived. She had to go alone, wait there, and a van would pick her up to take her to the clinic where they would operate on her. I begged her not to go, not to get into that van, but she told me I didn't understand. That it was her life and her decision, and that everything was already planned. I asked her if she wanted me to go with her, but she rejected me with a firm gesture. She had to go alone, she repeated. That was one of the conditions. I stood there watching her get into a car and drive away down that dusty road. It was the last time I saw my cousin as she was. That image stayed burned in my mind, and even today I can see her figure fading into the distance while I stood there helpless. The week that followed was torture. We didn't hear anything from her. She didn't answer messages, didn't pick up calls, and each day that passed without news made the anxiety and fear grow. My aunt and uncle were desperate, but she had told them she was going on a trip with some friends, and although they didn't like the idea, they didn't think something like this could happen. By the time she finally came back after 7 days of silence, she wasn't the same person. I saw my cousin get out of that car, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. It wasn't just that she was thinner. She was pale with sunken eyes, and her body seemed fragile, almost ready to break. She looked like a distorted version of herself, as if someone had rebuilt her wrong, leaving out all the parts that made her her. Her legs were so thin they seemed unable to hold her up. Her hips were sunken, and her abdomen, which was supposedly going to be perfect, had a strange shape, with lumps and scars peeking out from under her clothes. The most disturbing thing was her face. Her face, which had always been round and full of life, was now sunken and gaunt. Her cheekbones protruded in an unnatural way. Her lips were swollen and disproportionate, and her eyes, those big expressive eyes, now looked like two empty wells devoid of life. I couldn't believe it was her. She looked like a shadow of what she had been, a monster from a nightmare, and every time I looked at her I felt a pain in my chest I couldn't describe. I tried to talk to her, but every time I did, she quickly changed the subject. She said everything had gone perfectly, that she felt great, but I knew she was lying. Her movements were clumsy, as if every step hurt. I heard her cry more than once in her room, but when I asked, she told me she was tired, that it was normal to feel that way after surgery. But there was nothing normal about what I was seeing. Each day she grew weaker, more distant, and every time she looked in the mirror, her smile seemed more forced, more desperate. The details of what happened during that week were hazy. She told me that the van picked her up at the agreed place, and that the windows were covered so she couldn't see where they were taking her. When they arrived, she said they dropped her off at what seemed like a hospital, but she couldn't remember anything clearly. The operating rooms were cold and dirty, and although she said everything went well, I knew it didn't. What they did to her destroyed her completely. The days passed, and the situation only got worse. My cousin had become a shadow of herself, not only physically but also emotionally. She seemed like a specter wandering around the house, lost, as if she didn't know how to fit into her own body. The family tried to understand what was happening, but she wouldn't talk. She just said she was fine, that it was all part of the recovery process. But we all knew it wasn't. Nights became hell. I could hear her crying in her room, her sobs filtering through the walls and getting into my head. They weren't normal cries, they were heartbreaking, filled with a sadness that tore me apart. I wanted to go in, hug her, and tell her everything was going to be okay, but I knew those words wouldn't make any difference. I couldn't recognize her, and the worst part is I think she couldn't recognize herself either. Her friends began to drift away. At first, when she returned, they all tried to support her, but her transformation scared them. They didn't know how to treat her, how to talk to her, and little by little they stopped visiting. She was left alone, isolated, trapped in a prison she had created herself by seeking that perfection she had always longed for. Watching her like that was torture. It seemed like all her efforts to change had led her to a much worse place. As time went on, her health began to deteriorate alarmingly. At first, it was small colds that wouldn't go away, then infections that left her bedridden for days. Her body wasn't responding, as if it was giving up. Her immune system was shot, and every little health issue turned into a battle she couldn't win. My cousin, the same person who had dreamed of a perfect body and a new life, now didn't even have the strength to get out of bed. Doctor visits became constant, but no one could figure out exactly what was wrong. The test showed low levels of everything: immunity, red blood cells, essential nutrients. It was like her body was decomposing from the inside. The doctors couldn't find a clear cause, and my cousin, in her denial, never mentioned what they had done to her in that dark place. Everything was wrapped in a deadly silence, and we, her family, were powerless, not knowing how to help her. I remember one day in particular, a rainy afternoon I will never forget. My cousin was sitting in the kitchen looking at herself in a small hand mirror. The dim light of the evening filtered through the window, and her reflection was a devastating sight. Her eyes filled with tears as she touched her face, as if searching for something that was no longer there. I walked up to her and asked if she was okay, though I knew the answer wouldn't be honest. "I'm fine," she said in a trembling voice, not looking me in the eye. Her voice shook, and her hand, thin and fragile, shook even more. I tried to comfort her, but every word felt empty without weight. I didn't know how to reach her, how to break through that barrier of pain that enveloped her. The truth is, I didn't know what to say. Seeing her like that, so defeated, broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. It was in that moment that she told me the little she could remember. She told me that, in that place, everything had been fast and almost mechanical. The doctors didn't talk to her, didn't explain anything. They sedated her and took her to a dirty operating room. With flickering lights and a coldness that cut through to her bones, she remembered parts, disordered fragments of what they did to her, but she couldn't piece it all together. She only remembered waking up in a hard bed, in pain all over her body, with the feeling that something was terribly wrong. They gave her some pills and sent her back, nothing more. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I'd read about those procedures. That fat, those parts of her body they took out, probably weren't sold legally. Who knows what they did with them? The idea that those remains could be in the hands of some psychopath or worse was unbearable to me. Every time I thought about it, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I couldn't get it out of my head. It was like she had handed parts of herself over to something monstrous and sick. Weeks turned into months, and the situation didn't improve. My cousin grew weaker and weaker, and the doctors didn't know what else to do. Treatments were tried, medications were changed, but nothing seemed to work. She kept getting worse, as if her body was slowly wilting. Every time I visited her, I found her more disconnected from reality. There were days when she didn't even get out of bed, and I knew the guilt of what she had done was consuming her. One day, 2 years after all this, my cousin didn't wake up. She left in silence, alone in her room with no one able to stop it. Her body couldn't take it anymore, and simply stopped working. It was a hard blow, but deep down we knew her health had been spiraling downward for a long time. They told us it had been a combination of multiple organ failures, an accumulation of problems her body could no longer handle. The funeral was devastating. Watching my aunt and uncle cry next to her coffin, wondering what they had done wrong, was something I'll never be able to forget. No one knew the full truth, and I didn't have the courage to tell them everything. They couldn't know. They couldn't understand that all this had started with an ad in the darkest part of the internet. I stayed silent, carrying the guilt of not having done more to stop her. Every day, the same image haunts me. My cousin getting into that van, so excited to change her life. She never knew what she was really doing, and I'll never forgive myself for not protecting her from it. When I look back, all I can think about is how stupid it all was, how her life slowly faded away because of an empty promise, made by unscrupulous people who only wanted to prey on her insecurities. Cosmetic surgeries may seem like an easy solution, but you have to think carefully, and only do it in safe places with real professionals. My cousin was a victim of her own desperation, of her need to be someone she wasn't. And although she's no longer here, her story is a painful reminder of what can happen when we fall into the wrong hands. I'll never know exactly what they did to her or what happened to the remains they took from her. But I do know that this quest for perfection is what destroyed her. This is a story that should have never been told because it should have never happened. And even though it hurts to talk about it, I hope it serves as a warning for those who think anything is worth it to change their appearance. Sometimes the price is much higher than we imagine. Let me explain. I was a high school senior at the time, and I was definitely not a popular kid. My friends and I were the weird ones at school, the few who dared to challenge the norm. It was them who first told me about the deep web, a place on the internet where you're completely unsupervised, anonymous, able to do whatever you wanted. Of course, I was intrigued. Most of my friends only used it to buy drugs, but I was thinking about something bigger. I wanted to know what happened in the darkest corners of the deep web. Whether my friends were telling the truth when they talked about horrible fetish sites and hitmen you could hire to kill whoever you wanted. Of course, I didn't plan on using any of that. It was the mystery that fascinated me. Entering those sites would be like peeking into a world only a few had seen, like a completely new experience. At that point, I was tired of the monotony of life. I woke up at the same time every day, went to school, attended the same classes, talked to the same people, went home, played video games, did homework, went to sleep, and then repeated it all. I wondered if other people got tired of it too. Anyway, it took me a while to dive into the deep web. As fascinated as I was, I'd been warned about what could happen to me. Who wouldn't be afraid of being threatened by hackers or stalked by some angry weirdo online? That kind of fear kept me away from the deep web until one day I mustered up the courage and decided it was time. It was time to dive into the bowels of the internet. Time to see a world I had only dreamed of. During the first week or so, it was boring. There were only drug sites and places where people exposed government secrets or whatever. Nothing as dark as I'd expected. I wasn't interested in politics, nor did I even do drugs, so that was useless to me. I wasn't into much of anything at that point, so I felt disappointed. The only reason I kept exploring was my sheer desire to experience the world I thought existed on the deep web. That world was darker than any drug site. That world had murder, torture, and all kinds of nasty shit. Eventually, I found what I was looking for. The site didn't have a name. I thought it was a broken link for a moment, as it only took me to a black screen. Just before I could close the window, though, a chat box appeared on the screen. Someone with the name admin wrote in the chat box, "Congratulations, you found the worst place in the depths of the web." I stared at the screen, more puzzled than scared. It took me a moment to type back, "Cool." That's all I said. What else was there to say? "Hey, I'm here to see your finest torture porn." A moment later, the admin replied, "Do you want in?" I hesitated. All those horror stories flooded my head, but it was too late to chicken out now. This was what I'd come looking for. Even if I just closed the window at the first sign of danger, I had to see what was there. I had to know. Without allowing myself to stop, I wrote hesitantly, "Yes." The chat box closed, and I was taken directly to what seemed to be a video with another chat box on the side. There were about 5 other people there, all waiting eagerly for something. The video was in black and white and showed a small room. The only thing inside was a wooden chair. After about 5 minutes of waiting, the door to the room opened, and a man was pushed inside. He was blindfolded and only wearing a pair of black underwear. A woman followed him. She was dressed entirely in black, and her face was covered by a mask. In an instant, the chat room went wild. I almost closed the window to avoid witnessing it, knowing immediately where this was headed. But again, I told myself that this was what I wanted. Maybe not the torture, but the window into the worst of the world. The woman pulled a knife from her pocket and cut the man's blindfold while pushing him toward the chair. He didn't fight, and once his eyes were visible, I could see why. He seemed to be drugged. Resisting was impossible. I frowned, looking away. This was too sick. I knew it was wrong. My conscience told me to call the police or at the very least close the window, but I forced myself to watch. She turned toward the camera, pointing the knife at the man's neck. Someone in the chat wrote, "One of the fingers, cut off one of the fingers." I clenched my hands into fists, breathing sharply. Was this really happening? Was I going to watch this guy get mutilated while a small group of people watched in glee? I felt like vomiting, a feeling that only got worse when the woman nodded and then turned to the man, grabbed his limp hand, and carefully cut off one of his fingers. Blood spurted from the wound and the man groaned in pain, but he couldn't fight back. Breathing heavily, I hovered my cursor over the X, planning to leave quickly, but I didn't. The woman seemed dissatisfied, as if she thought the people in the chat could suggest something better. Another person asked her to cut off the man's arm, and she obliged. He was bleeding profusely now, clearly in deep pain, but these people were sick. They cheered her on from the chat, suggesting new, painful tortures for her to inflict. Eventually, I stopped breathing heavily. I stopped feeling sick. In fact, I started to enjoy it. By the end, the man was on the floor, covered in blood. I watched this for about 30 seconds. The people in the chat were starting to calm down. They had inflicted enough pain. They had had their fun. Curious, I thought, how it all ended just when I was starting to like it. I smiled. How exhilarating. This was better than any game I could play. Much better than any class I could attend. Better than sitting with a bunch of damn idiots pretending I cared about them for a second. This was the world I wanted to see. This was the darkness. This was the hidden face. This was reality. "That's it, finish it," I wrote in the chat for the first time. She nodded one last time. lifting the man before slowly sliding her knife across his throat, causing more blood to spurt out. When she finished, she let him drop, and he fell to the ground like an empty shell. The people in the chat started congratulating the torturer, talking about how it had been another good session, and beginning to set the date for the next one. On screen, the woman left the room, leaving the corpse behind. Of course, I quickly wrote down the date of the next session. This was going to be a part of my life now. I was going to be part of something bigger. I was going to preside over the deaths of these people. What a rush. So yeah, I still love the deep web. I'm in college now, and now I'm even more immersed in the deep web. I've seen things that would terrify some people to even know exist. I finally broke the monotony of life. Isn't it inspiring how a high school student defies the inherent boredom of life by discovering their true passion? I love the deep web. We've probably all heard the phrase, "I don't eat meat," more than 20 times a week. We hear it when we walk into a restaurant, we hear it when we order food, and we hear it in our daily conversations. And although I thought I would never say those words, an incident that occurred a few years ago made me swear I would never eat meat again. This horrifying story details my horrific experience and explains why I don't eat meat. I had just returned home from college. It was summer break. And coming home was always great because I got to see my childhood friends. Daniel was like my best friend since we had known each other since childhood. He was a bit shy and reserved, while I was extroverted and social. But despite our different personalities, we were like brothers. Every summer, there was a reunion where all our childhood friends would meet and catch up. Daniel didn't like going to those things, but I always forced him. When we arrived, we mingled, ate, and caught up with most of our other childhood friends. Toward the end of the event, a man approached us and I recognized him. It was Francisco Johansson. He was an eccentric food lover obsessed with finding new flavors. He was also an enormously popular YouTuber. His channel featured various food-related topics like ASMR, mukbangs, and new cuisines, basically anything to do with food. Although he was one of our childhood friends, we weren't really close to him because Francisco had been a bit strange as a kid. "Jeffrey, Daniel, great to see you," Francisco said as he hugged us. "You smell so good." Now, this was a weird comment since Daniel and I weren't wearing cologne, but I ignored it because I thought it was just one of his courtesies. So I said, "Good to see you, Francisco." Then he asked, "Did you enjoy the food?" Daniel replied, "It was great." "I'm so glad you enjoyed it because I made everything," he said. "Well, you did a great job. I thought it was delightful too," I responded. He smiled and said, "Now I'm going to film a new mukbang video for my YouTube channel, and I would love for you two to participate." Now, I wasn't really a food enthusiast, and neither was Daniel, but I didn't want to be rude, so I gladly agreed and told him we'd be in his YouTube video. Francisco then said, "Great, I'll send you my address and I'll see you on Wednesday," before leaving. Daniel wasn't very happy about this. "You shouldn't have done that, Jeffrey. You know I don't like going to things like this." "Don't worry," I responded. "I'm sure it will be a fun experience." Little did I know it would be an experience I'd never forget. Wednesday finally arrived, and we were driving to Francisco's house. Daniel was really anxious and told me, "I don't know about this, Jeffrey. I have a really weird feeling about this." We both know how weird Francisco is. I figured it was just Daniel's introverted nature acting up, so I calmed him down, saying, "Come on, man. We knew he was a bit weird when we were kids, but he's a grown man now." Daniel replied, "I know, but he's still weird. Didn't you notice how he looked at us at the reunion? He had that creepy smile and he said we smelled good, and we both know we weren't wearing cologne. Something seems off." I thought this was all probably just in Daniel's head, so I said, "I didn't really notice any of that, but it's probably all in your head, man. We'll be fine." We finally arrived at Francisco's house, and the first thing I noticed was how huge it was. I knew being a YouTuber paid well, but I didn't realize it paid this well. We knocked on the door and Fran quickly rushed to open it. He looked ecstatic, and the look he gave us was more of longing than happiness. He finally spoke. Come in," he said. We walked in and stood in the hallway. "You smell divine," he said. This time I was wearing cologne, which made it less weird, but there was something unsettling about the way he said it. "Thanks," I replied. Daniel was clearly uncomfortable hearing Fran say that again, but he smiled and nodded. "Wait here while I set up the cameras," Fran said before leaving. We sat in the hallway chairs, and the longer I sat there, the more anxious I started to feel, just like Daniel. I kept reminding myself at intervals that I was an adult and needed to stop being immature. The silence in the mansion was eerie and unnerving. "What the hell is that?" Daniel said, breaking the silence. I turned to see him staring at a painting on the wall. The painting seemed to consist of several human figures eating a small child. "Are they eating her?" Daniel said, visibly disturbed. I knew at first glance that was exactly what was happening, but I didn't want to scare Daniel, so I said, "It looks like it, but I'm not sure. It's a very strange painting." That's when we heard Francisco's voice from the end of the hallway. "Isn't it beautiful?" he said. "I found it at an art gallery. The painter said he was inspired by an ancient tribe that always felt incomplete, so to find wholeness they would take from others." Daniel responded with, "What does that even mean?" Francisco smiled and said, "Only people with a true understanding of art can grasp it." "Well, I think it's a shitty painting and you should ask for your money back," Daniel said. I could see Daniel was upset, so I decided to step in. But before I could say anything, Francisco continued, "Well, it cost me $20,000 and I don't regret spending that much because it was worth it. You may not see the beauty now, dear Daniel, but in time you will." Daniel was about to say something, but Francisco quickly cut him off. "The cameras are ready and I'd like for us to start filming the video." Daniel wasn't happy, but he said, "Fine, let's do it." As we walked toward the kitchen, I could tell Daniel was angry with me since I was the one who dragged him into this, and it showed. I was extremely anxious too, but Fran seemed completely oblivious to all of this, as he still had a huge smile on his face. I knew Fran had always been a weird guy, but this was getting to be too much, and just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, he showed us what we were going to eat. At first glance, you knew it was meat, but the question was, what kind? It didn't look like pork, beef, or chicken, and it didn't smell like any of them either. I looked at Daniel and knew he was thinking the exact same thing. But before Daniel could say anything, I asked Francisco, "What kind of meat is this? Because it doesn't look like anything I've ever had. Is it lamb?" He looked at us and said, "Well, if I told you, it would ruin the point of the mukbang video. You don't need to know what it is, just know that it's delicious." He then told us to sit down because he was about to start the video. But my mind was already racing in many directions. I wasn't even paying attention to what Francisco was saying in the introduction, as I started to wonder if Daniel had been right all along. Had I been too nice? I was about to say something when Fran finally said to the camera, "Now, my childhood friends and I are going to try this mystery meat." He handed us a portion, and despite my lack of enthusiasm about eating whatever it was, I decided to get it over with and get out of there. As Fran began eating, Daniel and I put the mystery meat in our mouths, and as soon as it touched my tongue, it was like all my worries melted away. There are no words to describe how delicious that mystery meat tasted. I instinctively went for another piece, and so did Daniel. Fran started laughing as he said to the camera, "Looks like they like it." I ate until I was full that day, and suddenly all the anxiety, fear, and weirdness vanished. After the video ended, we had a great afternoon together. It turned out there was more to Fran than just food. He liked video games, music, and movies too, and we talked and bonded for the rest of the afternoon. Just when I let out a sigh of relief because I felt comfortable again, and so did Daniel, I thought to myself, I'm glad I came. As we were sitting there talking, Daniel finally said, "But seriously, that mystery meat was delicious. What was it really?" Fran said the meat was imported, but I was sure it was just a combination of various meats, as I'd tasted a hint of chicken. As he continued talking, I felt the need to go to the bathroom, so I asked Fran where it was, and he told me it was down the hall to the left. After using the bathroom, I started to head back to the living room, but I felt very thirsty since I'd eaten a lot of meat, so I went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed some water to drink. While I was drinking the water, I started to notice something out of the corner of my eye. Was that I screamed before I could finish the thought. Right there in Fran's fridge was what looked like a child's hand, and the more I looked, the worse it got. Behind the groceries, there were more human parts, feet, arms, fingers, and that's when my brain put it all together. I immediately vomited and started screaming again. That's when I heard Daniel calling me, "Jeffrey, are you all?" I didn't hear how he finished the sentence. The only thing I heard was a dull sound, like something had fallen, followed by silence. It wasn't long before Fran was standing in the kitchen holding a metal pipe. The end of the pipe had something red that I thought was blood. He stood there staring at me in silence with a smile on his face for about 2 minutes before saying, "I see you found your favorite dish." I wanted to say something, but I ended up vomiting again, and before I could lift my head, I felt the hard blow of the metal pipe and lost consciousness. I started to open my eyes slowly, and the first thing I saw was bright, flickering lights. It took a while before my vision focused and I could finally see my surroundings. I was in what seemed to be a basement. I was also tied to what appeared to be a hard concrete block. The block had red liquid stains all over it and reminded me of a butcher's table. To my right, I saw Daniel. He was unconscious and also tied to something similar. I could hear Fran's voice saying, "How are you, my eccentric food lovers?" Now that you've seen the preliminary video, here's where the real fun begins, and I'm doing this just for you, my premium fans. I could finally see him. He was standing in front of a camera. He was wearing an apron and there were lights set up around us. I felt a little dizzy from the blow to the head, but I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "Fran, you sick bastard." Then slowly, he turned to look at me, and he had that sickening smile on his face. "Look, friends, our meal has woken up," he said as he looked into the camera. "What do you want from us?" I yelled. He slowly looked at me and said, "What do we want?" "We want what you haven't appreciated all these years, the divine food you've been all along." He walked over to me and buried his nose in my chest. "You smell so good, so delicious, your sweat is doing an excellent job seasoning you." As he said those words, the realization hit me. "So that's what you meant by that?" I asked. He didn't respond. He just walked over to the camera and said, "Enough chit-chat with the food." He walked over to a shelf and pulled out what seemed to be a toolkit, starting to take out all sorts of sharp butcher knives. He then looked at the camera and spoke as if he were on a cooking show, talking to an audience. "Now, when the meat is this fresh, there are some parts that are only delicious when eaten raw." He then walked over to Daniel with a knife in hand. He lifted Daniel's head and held his ear. With a clean cut, he sliced off Daniel's ear. My stomach churned and I felt like vomiting again. I guess the pain woke Daniel up because he immediately started screaming. And Fran, without hesitation, popped Daniel's bloody ear into his mouth as if it were a cookie. I looked at him in disgust as I started screaming, "That's my friend." He looked at me and said, "Look at me like that all you want. We both know you love the taste. Did you see your eyes as you devoured that meat? You had tasted something divine, and after that there's no going back. Don't you see, Jeffrey? We are all walking cuisines. Children, teenagers, adults, each of us has our own unique flavor, and I have to taste them all." Daniel was screaming and began to cry. I looked at Fran as he kept ranting all his nonsense, but the only thing going through my mind was, I have to get out of here and I have to get Daniel out with me. Because part of me knew this was all my fault. If only I had listened to Daniel, he wouldn't be in this mess. I started to tug profusely at my restraints. My wrists and ankles hurt, but I didn't care. As I was doing this, I watched him walk toward Daniel's feet, and as he looked at the camera, he said, "Another wonderful part to eat raw is the toes. The taste is incredible." And without hesitation, I watched him bite into 2 of my friend's toes. He looked like an animal with blood all over his face as he said to the camera, "Now, when you eat the toes raw, you have to suck and nibble, not bite all the way through to avoid hitting the bone." Daniel was now screaming uncontrollably, and I could only imagine the pain he was feeling. I kept pulling at my restraints until my hands and feet felt like they were about to burst. What Fran did next is something I still see every time I close my eyes. He walked up to Daniel and said, "Now you don't want your food moving when you're cutting the best parts, so it's better to let them bleed out. A clean, thin cut to the neck should do the trick, not too deep." He paused and continued, "We have good stuff in there." He looked at me, and with that, he carefully sliced Daniel's throat. Blood spurted from Daniel's neck and down his chest. "Oh, it's so messy," Fran said, wiping the knife on his apron and walking away. As I watched Daniel slowly bleed out and stop moving, I started screaming, "Daniel! Hold on, man, I'm getting you out of here." Fran, who was completely unfazed by everything happening, kept talking to the camera. "Now we have to get the preserving oil since we need to keep the meat in optimal condition. Be right back." He walked up the stairs, and with that, he was gone. As I watched Daniel slowly bleed out and stop moving, I started to cry. "Don't worry, man, I'm getting you out of here. I'll fix this." I sat in tears. Then Daniel started to speak. It was obvious it was hard for him, but he did it anyway. "It's okay, Jeffrey," he told me in a very low voice. "None of this is your fault, not you. Make sure you get out of here. You're my brother, man, and I love you." Silence followed. He stopped moving. I could see his blood all over his body, and I started calling out his name. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew he was dead. While crying, I started tugging harder at my restraints until I felt my wrist snap. The pain was unimaginable, but I was free. I walked over to Daniel's body and started sobbing. I saw the metal pipe on the ground and picked it up. I started hearing footsteps, so I waited at the bottom of the stairs. "I'm back, guys," I heard him say. "I hope the meat is bled out by now." And without hesitation, I struck him hard in the face, and he fell to the ground. I noticed he was still breathing, and although he was unconscious, I wanted to kill him with every fiber of my being, but I didn't. I told myself I'd already ruined my life by killing my best friend. Killing him would only ruin my life even more. So instead of beating him to death, I went upstairs to call the police. After that, I went back down to the basement. I walked over to Daniel's body and cried uncontrollably. The weeks that followed seemed to pass in a quick blur. The police called me in for questioning, and I told them everything I knew. They told me I was lucky to be alive because of the 30 victims they found. None had escaped Fran. They also told me he had been running a secret streaming channel for his premium subscribers on the deep web, which explains why he was filming us. They found over 1,000 users, which alarmed me because it meant there were 1,000 people as sick as Fran. The victims' families were informed and they all demanded justice, but Francisco pleaded insanity, so he was taken to a high-security psychiatric hospital. Daniel's parents were devastated by this, and I heard the families of the other victims were appealing the case for him to get a life sentence or even the death penalty. I hope they succeeded because that man truly deserved to die at the hands of justice. We buried Daniel that week, and I said my final goodbye to my best friend. It's been 5 years since this incident, and instead of letting it break me down mentally, I moved on with my life. I'm now married, and I have a 2-year-old daughter. I still go to therapy regularly, but it doesn't really help because every time I close my eyes, I find myself back in that place. And although I don't eat meat, I sometimes feel an irresistible urge to do so. Sometimes I find myself looking at my little girl, drooling and wondering what she would taste like. Sometimes I look at my wife the same way. I regularly have thoughts of cutting off my arm and cooking it just to get that taste, but I use all my strength to overcome those morbid thoughts because I love my family. No matter how hard it is, I'll keep moving forward. Francisco Johansson may have been a depraved sicko, but he wasn't lying when he said, "Once you taste something divine, there's no going back." And that's the worst part. The taste, the memories, it all lingers, haunting me no matter how much I try to push it away. I know what I experienced was horrific, and I know how wrong it is to even entertain the thoughts that sometimes flood my mind. But it's like a part of me was forever changed, corrupted by that day. The therapy sessions help me keep things under control, but they don't erase the memories. I still wake up in cold sweats, dreaming about that basement, seeing Daniel tied up, watching Fran bite into his flesh. Sometimes I wake up with my heart racing, hands trembling, because I can still hear Daniel's voice telling me it wasn't my fault. But deep down, I'll never forgive myself for dragging him into that nightmare. He trusted me, and I led him straight into the hands of a monster. My wife knows about my past, at least the parts I've been able to share. She doesn't know the full extent of the horror or the thoughts that sometimes creep in when I'm alone. I've shielded her from it, not wanting her to see the darkness that still lingers in me. But there are moments when I see her looking at me with concern, knowing that something isn't quite right. She senses it even if I don't speak about it. As for my daughter, she's my reason for holding on. Every time I look at her, I remind myself of the love I have for her, the innocence she embodies, and how I need to protect her from the darkness that tried to consume me. But the urges sometimes feel overpowering. The memories of that taste, that divine flavor, resurface when I least expect them, and it takes everything in me to suppress them. I know that I'll never be the same. I'll never look at meat or people in the same way again. That day, something in me broke, and while I've managed to keep it from completely overtaking me, it's always there, lurking in the background. I can't escape it, and I'm not sure if I ever will, but I have to keep trying. For my family, for Daniel, for myself. Even though Francisco Johansson may have been right about one thing, that once you taste something divine, there's no going back, I refuse to let his twisted view of the world define me. I won't let him win. I'll keep fighting these urges no matter how strong they get. Because in the end, I know that what truly matters isn't the taste of flesh, but the love and humanity we have for each other. And that's something I refuse to let go of, no matter how much the darkness tries to pull me in. I'm pretty sure everyone on the internet has heard of and used the website called Wikipedia, known as the largest collection of knowledge ever accumulated collaboratively in one place. It is often said that the website is the biggest and most read reference work in history. We've all used it for work, school, and even for research purposes. As the number of visitors to the website grows each day, so does its popularity. However, what most Wikipedia users don't know is that the website has a truly disturbing and dark side. While everyone knows about Wikipedia, few people are aware of the hidden wiki located on the dark web. This horrifying website is inaccessible to the average internet user, as accessing it requires the use of the Tor browser. Unlike the free encyclopedia we all know, Wikipedia's dark brother contains content that will make your stomach turn. The website's disturbing links lead to hitmen, illegal chemicals, banned weapons, and uncensored content. Because of all this, my experience with the site was truly horrible, and the story you're about to hear will explain why. I remember this time at school very well because it was a period we all called the dark web phase. I can't recall how it started, but every student at school was obsessed with the dark web. My classmates would dare each other to go on the dark web, and anyone who didn't do it would be mocked and called a coward. Each new day, a student would come to school with a disturbing story and photos, telling us about the horrors they had seen on the dark web. These stories ranged from watching people being killed in the infamous Red Rooms to buying illegal content on the infamous Silk Road. Basically, everyone was doing it, and those who weren't were dared to do the same. Soon it became a kind of sick rite of passage, as using the dark web was considered cool, and it wasn't long before my turn came. I can still remember the fear in my heart that day when my friends dared me to visit the dark web. Even in my late teens, I couldn't handle morbid and disturbing content well, so I wasn't sure if I was going to do it. However, I knew that if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to face my friends. Looking back now, although I was terrified, the peer pressure to do it was overwhelming. All my friends were venturing into the dark web, and I told myself that there was no reason why I couldn't do the same. So that day, I gathered the courage and downloaded the anonymous browser called Tor. For those who don't know, the Tor browser, or the onion router as it's called, is one of the few ways to access the dark web. Unlike the visible web, the dark web is a bit all over the place. It's not uniform and can be overwhelming. Google doesn't exist on the dark web as it has its own strange search engines. There are a few popular ones called Not Evil and Torch, which people use to navigate the dark web, but using those search engines can be very tricky for new users, especially if you don't know what you're looking for. However, there was one particular website that my friends had told me to visit, and this website was called the Hidden Wiki. It's a bit hard to properly explain what the Hidden Wiki is, as it's not a traditional search engine, but in simple terms, it's essentially a collection of popular dark web links. Once I got to the Hidden Wiki website, I encountered numerous websites that led to illegal weapons, hard drugs, and snuff content. There were many links to choose from, as I saw most of the major dark web websites, like the Cannibal Forum, where real cannibals discuss how it feels to eat human meat and fresh organs. I even saw a link to the Human Experiments page, a horrifying forum that's considered one of the most disturbing sites on the deep web. This was because the people behind the website performed morbid experiments on live people. Apparently, there are experimental videos of these people injecting bleach into pregnant women, sterilizing unwilling participants, exposing babies to radiation, and many other horrible things that I can't even describe. I kept scrolling through the Hidden Wiki website, taking it all in, and for some unknown reason, I was drawn to one particular link called Steak and Cheese, often referred to as rotten.com. This website is known for having a large collection of macabre, violent, and grotesque videos. After clicking the link, I was taken to the Steak and Cheese homepage. The content I saw there is enough to make any man vomit everything they've eaten that day. I still feel disgusted to this day by the things I saw, as they were practically extreme snuff content. There were numerous videos of children being tortured with chains, most of them no older than 8. Another video called The Divine Feast showed live cannibalism, featuring a man eating dismembered human parts. The more I looked at the website, the more horrified I became. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I came across a video titled True Eaters. I watched the horrific footage of the people in the video happily tearing apart small animals like kittens and rats before swallowing the animals' corpses. I had only been on the website for a few minutes, but I already wanted to leave. I was having second thoughts about the whole thing and didn't think I could watch more. But before I could leave, I caught a glimpse of a link to a video titled Miss Necrophilia. From what I could gather, Miss Necrophilia seemed to be a dancer. She had many videos on her page where she sang songs and danced with what appeared to be plastic mannequins. Looking back, I don't know why I didn't leave the website at that moment. I had already seen more than enough disturbing content, but my curiosity got the better of me as I was drawn to the Miss Necrophilia video. It was the only normal video I had seen on the entire Steak and Cheese website, so I gave in and clicked on the video link to watch it in full. At the start of the video, the woman I assumed was Miss Necrophilia just stared blankly at the camera. She had put on a lot of black mascara both above and below her eyes. I can still remember the look in her eyes as she continued to stare at the camera. It's hard to put into words, but her eyes seemed completely hollow and she looked like she had no soul. The video then cut to her living room, where she had 4 mannequins sitting in chairs behind her. The living room was better lit so I could see more clearly, but that's when I noticed something strange about these mannequins. For one, they looked too realistic to be mannequins, as the hair on the mannequins, especially on the one that resembled a man in his 40s, looked too real. I had similar thoughts about the other 3 mannequins. The first 2 were mannequins of 2 young children, a boy and a girl who looked around 9 and 10 years old. As Miss Necrophilia carried the mannequins back and forth, I noticed the movements of their fingers, which seemed really odd, and I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. Even with how strange the first 3 mannequins looked, it was the last one that disturbed me the most. This particular mannequin resembled a 10-month-old baby, but what bothered me about this one was the fact that it looked like a pale, life-size doll. Miss Necrophilia then lifted the larger male mannequin and began dancing with it while singing a strangely cheerful tune. I couldn't understand what she was singing, as the song was in another language, but as she danced and sang with her mannequin, I felt like there was something I wasn't seeing. And then it hit me. The horrific realization finally struck me when Miss Necrophilia brought the life-size doll closer to the camera while she danced. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw that thousands of maggots were all over the male mannequin she was dancing with. And then my brain finally understood. They weren't mannequins or life-size dolls. They were corpses. They were all stiff and embalmed in something, which is why I mistook them for mannequins at first. If she hadn't brought them closer to the camera, I would never have realized they were starting to rot. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My mind struggled to comprehend the atrocious atrocity I had just witnessed, and I froze in shock. I tried to find an explanation for why a woman would be dancing with corpses in her own living room, but I couldn't. Things took an even scarier turn when I noticed the photo in the background. It was a family photo showing a pregnant Miss Necrophilia, her husband, and their 2 children, all of whom bore an uncanny resemblance to the corpses. My stomach couldn't handle it anymore as I felt bile rising in my throat. Even after vomiting my lunch, I still couldn't move. I was hypnotized in front of the screen and couldn't move my hands to stop the video. Looking back, I don't know how long I was frozen in front of the screen. It could have been 15 minutes or more. But after a while, a dialog box popped up on my screen that snapped me out of that horrific trance. The strange chat box came from an anonymous chat room on the dark web, and the message said, "You've been watching this video for too long, friend. I guess you enjoy Miss Necrophilia's content. I'm a big fan of hers too, you know. She takes requests, and I'm sure Allison will be the perfect candidate for the next dancing corpse. After all, she takes ballet classes." My heart sank into my stomach when I saw the name Allison, and I let out a guttural scream. I told myself it couldn't be, but I don't believe in coincidences. Allison was the name of my 12-year-old little sister. I had no idea how the person on the other side of that message knew that. What disturbed me even more was the fact that she took ballet classes after school, and it was every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I looked at the date again, and April 16th, 2010 fell on a Friday. With adrenaline and fear coursing through my body, I grabbed my phone and called the police. I was speaking so fast I was basically incoherent. Even after my call, the police thought it was a prank, so I immediately called my mom and asked where my sister was. She told me school had ended and she had just dropped her off at ballet class. I then urged her to call the ballet school and confirm that Allison was still there, but when she called, The school said Allison was nowhere to be found. All the color drained from my face as I imagined the worst. I tried to explain everything, but I couldn't find the words. I knew this wasn't something I could properly explain over the phone, so I ran to my mother's office. It was fairly close to our house, so I was able to get there in under 8 minutes. I arrived there panting and out of breath, and I took a few seconds to calm down before telling my mom everything. When I finished, my mother reached out and slapped me across the face. She had never hit me in my life, and I knew exactly why she did it. I had put my little sister's life in danger, all for a stupid dare. I could see the tears and fear in her eyes as she dialed 911. When the call went through, she calmly told them everything that had happened. They then told us to wait at least 24 to 48 hours before declaring her missing, but my mom pleaded with the officers to do something now, as she felt time was of the essence. My mom's old friend, Officer Daniel Barnes, was on the force and was able to convince them to start a search within an hour. Officers filled the streets with photos of my little sister in hand, asking if anyone had seen her. After telling the officers everything, I also joined the search for my little sister, and with each passing hour, my heartbeat quickened. We searched for 13 straight hours, covering the entire town, but we found nothing. My mother, who had completely broken down in tears, couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't blame her, as I was the only one at fault. As tensions kept rising, I began to think the worst, imagining Allison brutally murdered by psychopaths, and I wondered if I would see her in the next Miss Necrophilia video. Both the officers and the rest of the search team were visibly tired now. They were starting to slow down, and people wanted to go home and continue tomorrow. But just before the search was called off, we got word that she had been found lying on a bench at the edge of town. We drove as fast as we could to get to the location, and my mom cried tears of joy as she embraced Allison. She was examined by paramedics, who said she had been chloroformed but was fine. When she regained consciousness, we asked her what had happened, and she told us she had been taken from her ballet class a few minutes after our mom dropped her off. She said she didn't remember much after being grabbed, as the world was a blur. But one thing she didn't forget was the only thing he said to her. When I asked her what he said, my little sister looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Tell Daniel I said hello." This entire experience put the whole town on red alert. Our family had to move in with my mother's sister while the authorities watched our house to make sure it was safe. I was questioned again, and I told the officers everything. I also assured them that I had used an anonymous browser, but they told me that didn't matter with the kind of people on the dark web, as accessing my IP address or my computer's webcam and history is easy with the level of hackers roaming the dark web. Detectives believe that's how they manage to get such personal and private information in a matter of seconds. The authorities made numerous attempts to track down the unidentified man who had kidnapped my sister, but like everything else on the dark web, it was untraceable. And no matter how hard they tried, it was as if he had vanished into thin air. They also tried to track down Miss Necrophilia, but that also proved impossible, as her videos had been removed from the Steak and Cheese website. As the investigation came to a close and I returned to school, I heard that the whole dark web phase had died down, as both teachers and authorities were actively warning students against using or visiting the dark web. It took a while for our family to get past that incident. My mom said she had forgiven me, but I could never forgive myself for what I put my family through. So please, to everyone who's listening, take my story as a warning to stay away from the dark web because, although it may seem fun to you at first, I know all too well that a simple dark web link can mark you for life. The story you just heard was based on an anonymous report from Franklin, Tennessee, to the Franklin Police Department on April 16, 2010. The FPD officer at the time received a frantic call from an unknown individual that afternoon, and the caller was apparently screaming about how they had seen a strange woman dancing with corpses on the dark web. The caller then told the officer they believed he and his family were going to be killed by the woman in the video because she wanted to dance with their corpses next. But before the officer could say or do anything, the line went dead. Numerous attempts were made to contact the frantic caller, but they never answered their phone. The Franklin authorities tried to trace the call, but that proved futile as it was difficult to pinpoint the exact location of the caller. With no way to track the caller, the detectives tried to find the unidentified woman who was dancing with the corpses and uploading the videos to the dark web. While they were able to find records of dark web users who had witnessed and viewed these morbid videos on the dark web, they were unable to locate the woman or the original videos as they had been deleted. With no leads, the case was never officially opened or pursued. As the years passed, the case grew cold and was eventually forgotten. But to this day, no one knows what happened to the frantic caller or the strange woman detectives called the macabre dancer, who is still out there somewhere, filming herself dancing with corpses and uploading these disturbing videos to the dark web. People say a single act can change your life. What they don't tell you is that it works both ways, for better or for worse. I don't know about you, but believe me, my life is now ruined forever. This is something I'll have to live with. I was 19 at the time. Getting into college made me see my life in a whole new way. I've always been extroverted, so I never thought twice about attending a party or hanging out with a new group of people. I shared an apartment with one of the seniors at the university. He was often busy partying with friends. Whenever I came home after school, I could see them drinking or smoking around the house, sometimes even using drugs. One night I was really frustrated. I was having some issues with my current relationship, so I went to my senior's room to relax for a while. I thought being around a group of strangers might take my mind off things. I knocked on his door and he took his time opening it. He slowly opened the door and looked at me. I could tell by his eyes that he was high, and I also noticed he was alone in the room. He motioned for me to come in. The room's curtains were all closed, and even during the day, his room was completely dark. The only light in the room came from his desktop computer in one corner. He asked in a deep voice, "Trouble with your girlfriend?" I was surprised, and then he said, "I heard you arguing on the phone, sit down." I was embarrassed for being so loud earlier. My senior sat down next to me and passed me a cigarette. I sometimes smoked with my friends, so I took it and lit it. My eyes wandered to his computer screen. The Google page looked completely different, and I noticed the URL wasn't .com like we usually see on Google. Instead, it said .onion. I realized his browser was completely different. As I sat there smoking in silence, he started snorting cocaine right in front of me. I had seen people doing drugs before, so I wasn't shocked at all. After a few minutes, my senior turned to me and asked with his bloodshot eyes, "Want some? It'll help you deal with your troubled mind," and he started laughing like a maniac. I'm sure you're all thinking I left his room immediately, but unfortunately, that didn't happen. I was really frustrated, as I mentioned before. My girlfriend had insulted me, saying I needed to grow up and stuff like that. I don't know what I was thinking, but one thing's for sure. I channeled my anger in a very wrong way. I didn't realize that drugs are never the solution to any problem. I did what I shouldn't have done. An hour later, my mind was on an euphoric trip. I felt extremely confident and started talking a lot. A lot. I asked my senior, "What's going on with your computer? Your Google page doesn't look right." He laughed really hard and said, "Man, this isn't kids' stuff, it's not Google." I was high as a kite and curious at the same time. I wanted to know more. My senior told me he was browsing the dark web, which is often called the deep web. The dark web is part of the internet that's invisible to search engines. To access it, you need a completely different browser called Tor. I had heard a lot about the dark web from my friends and about the dangerous stuff that happens there, but seeing it for the first time gave me chills. I learned there's a site on the dark web called Silk Road, which is considered the Amazon of drugs. People can buy all kinds of illegal drugs on this site, and the currency used to pay here is bitcoins. Eventually, I found out that my senior buys his drugs from this site, and they arrive as an anonymous package with no registered ID or address. After that day, things took a bad turn for me. I got into such a deep addiction that I don't think I can get out of it. I became addicted with my regular habit of using cocaine. 2 of my friends joined in too. We often bought our supply through my senior, so there was never any unsafe situation. After 2 months, my senior moved out with his girlfriend since it was his last month of college. He told us he had quit the addiction after getting clean when we called him to buy more. But we were out of options, so I decided to buy some for myself on the dark web. I was browsing Silk Road one night in my room when suddenly an ad link popped up in the right corner of my screen. The ad said, "Doctors, get the best dash at the cheapest price." I clicked on the link and it took me to an unknown page full of illegal medications. I saw people posing as doctors selling various pills and drugs at really cheap prices. I got really excited about getting such good deals and ordered some without reading or thinking about it. About a week later, an unknown package arrived at my door. I invited my friends over for dinner, and we all sat down to get high. As soon as I snorted the first line, something horrible happened. The powder made my nostrils burn like hell. I immediately grabbed my head and started screaming, lying on the floor. My friends were lucky since they hadn't started yet. I saw blood coming out of my nose. My friend took me to the bathroom and made me inhale water through my nose to flush out the effect. After a few minutes of doing that and vomiting my guts out, I was completely drained. My body felt numb and all I wanted was to sleep for hours. I even took a painkiller to kill the throbbing pain in my head and went to bed. My friends called my senior and he came over the next morning. We explained everything to him and he seemed really upset about getting me into this. I told him it wasn't his fault and that I had become addicted. After that, I quit drugs completely, but a sense of curiosity lingered inside me. I was sure I had been scammed on the dark web with fake drugs, but I wanted to know what that white powder really was. So I asked one of my friends, who had a girlfriend in the microbiology department at our university. She was researching the effects of pharmaceutical drugs on the human mind, so I thought she could help us figure out what that stuff really was. My hands still tremble as I'm about to tell you the ultimate horror that devastated me for life. She ran a couple of tests on the powder but couldn't find any toxic substances in it. She was shocked to realize it wasn't a drug, but she lost her mind when she discovered it was nothing but powder made from human bones. Yes, I snorted human bones. That's right, the powder particles were so sharp that they made my veins bleed. Thank God only a small amount got into me since I stopped, thinking about how it would be the first time. I still have no explanations when I think about why a group of lunatics would sell human bone powder online. I wonder how they got it, or if they made it themselves.